Somewhere in the Naval Museum at Qingdao sits a warship that never fired a shot in anger. Yet without it, nothing else in this story would exist. It carries no missiles, no radar dish, nothing that looks remotely modern. But it is where China's destroyer story begins. From that single borrowed hull to a fleet that today rivals every navy on Earth except one, the journey covers 7 decades, 4 generations of technology, and a transformation few military planners saw coming. This is the complete story of every destroyer class China has built, bought, or borrowed, told in order, hull by hull, system by system. Some of these ships fought no wars, some barely left port. Others now sail beside aircraft carriers as the backbone of a genuine blue water navy. We start not with steel forged in a Chinese shipyard, but with a gift, and sometimes a warning, from an old ally turned rival. Along the way, watch for the pattern, borrow first, copy next, then eventually outbuild the teacher, because that pattern repeats itself more than once in this story, and by the end, it explains almost everything about the fleet China operates today. Chapter 1. Origins: China's Borrowed Navy. In 1955, the newly formed People's Liberation Army Navy did not have a single destroyer built on its own soil. What it had were 4 second-hand Soviet ships, transferred under a defense agreement and rechristened the Anshan class. Originally built in the Soviet Union in the 1930s as Gnievny-class destroyers, these 4 hulls were slow by the standards of the post-war era, armed mainly with torpedo tubes and manually aimed deck guns, but they were the only ocean-going warships China possessed. For nearly 2 decades, the Anshan class was the entire identity of Chinese destroyer power. The lead ship, Anshan herself, hosted foreign dignitaries and Chinese leaders including Zhou Enlai, functioning more as a symbol of naval ambition than as a genuine fighting asset. Over time, the torpedo tubes on some of these hulls were removed and replaced with early anti-ship missile launchers, a small but telling upgrade that turned a hand-me-down warship into something closer to a real deterrent. By the time Anshan herself was decommissioned in 1992, she had served for 38 years, longer than most of the ships that would eventually replace her. Today, she sits preserved at the Naval Museum in Qingdao, while a sister ship remains a stationary training vessel at the Dalian Naval Academy, a quiet monument to a navy that started with almost nothing. Borrowed ships can only carry a young navy so far, and by the mid-1960s, Chinese planners knew it. That realization pushed China toward its first truly indigenous design. Approved in 1967 and laid down the following year, the Type 051, known to NATO as the Luda class, became the country's first homegrown guided missile destroyer. 17 hulls were eventually built between 1968 and 1991. An extraordinary production run for a country still rebuilding its industrial base after years of political upheaval. At roughly 3,670 tons, the Luda class borrowed its general layout from the Soviet Kotlan design, but armed itself with something the Soviets had never handed over: the HY-2 Silkworm anti-ship missile, giving these ships genuine offensive teeth for the first time in Chinese naval history. It wasn't a flawless program. One hull, number 160, was lost in an accident, a sobering reminder of how young this capability still was. Some surviving ships later received modernization packages, including one refitted with a double helicopter hangar decades ahead of that feature becoming standard on Chinese destroyers, and others receiving new radar and a Crotale-derived short-range missile that replaced an entire rear gun turret. The design work itself was carried out by the 701 Institute in Wuhan, a design bureau that would go on to shape nearly every major surface combatant China built for the rest of the century. The last 2 Luda-class ships, Zhanjiang and Zhuhai, weren't decommissioned until August 2020, meaning a design approved in the 1960s remained in frontline service into the era of stealth hulls and phased array radar. That is a 50-year service span most navies can only dream of. And fittingly, those same two ships were retired on the very same day. Two brand new hulls, a Type 055 and a Type 52D, were launched at Dalian, an almost cinematic changing of the guard. Chinese state media covered the moment as a symbolic handover, and, in a very literal sense, it was 17 hulls of first-generation firepower stepping aside for a single afternoon that represented an entire new era of Chinese shipbuilding. Naming a warship after a city was standard practice by then, a tradition that continues in the fleet to this day. And it is one small thread tying the oldest hulls in this story to the newest ones still being launched. Chapter 2. Learning by Doing, the Experimental Years. By the early 1990s, China wanted more than missiles bolted onto an old hull design. It wanted a genuinely modern warship, and that meant looking west for inspiration. The Type 052, NATO reporting name Luhu, put its first two hulls, Harbin and Qingdao, into service, starting in 1994. It was a small class, just two ships, but its importance far outweighs its size. The Luhu introduced a helicopter hangar as a standard feature, a more Western hull layout, and a genuinely mixed propulsion arrangement, with one ship running American-built General Electric gas turbines and the other running Ukrainian-built engines instead, a strange split that reflected just how much foreign hardware China was still importing at the time. It was, in effect, a hull built from parts sourced across 3 different countries, at a moment when Western arms sales to China were about to close almost entirely, making the Luhu class something of a last-chance purchase before the door shut. Once that window closed after 1989, China had no choice but to lean harder on Russian suppliers and its own engineers for nearly everything that followed, a shift in strategy visible in almost every class that comes after this one. Few people remember how experimental the ship that followed really was. The Type 51B, NATO designation Luyang, produced exactly one hull, Shenzhen, commissioned in 1999. It was larger than anything China had built before, closer to a testbed than a true warship class, meant to prove that Chinese shipyards could handle a bigger, heavier hull ahead of the next generation of destroyers. Plans for sister ships were reportedly drawn up but never completed, and Shenzhen sailed alone for years as the fleet's odd one out. For self-defense, it carried the HQ-7 short-range missile in an octuple launcher, a useful system but a modest one compared to what was already on the drawing board elsewhere in the program. While Chinese engineers experimented at home, the Navy also went shopping abroad. Between 1999 and 2006, China took delivery of 4 Sovereignty-class destroyers purchased directly from Russia and built entirely on Russian soil, not Chinese ones. These were not incremental upgrades, they were a shortcut. The Sovereignty brought the SSN-22 Sunburn, a supersonic anti-ship missile capable of skimming just above the wave tops at speeds that gave almost no reaction time to an intercepting warship, a weapon originally designed by the Soviet Union with a very specific target in mind: American carrier battle groups. For a Navy still finding its footing in modern guided missile warfare, that kind of firepower, bought rather than built, closed a dangerous capability gap almost overnight, and it did so faster than any domestic shipyard could have managed alone. 2 of the 4 hulls were even upgraded to a modernized Sovereignty standard, with improved air defense missiles, before China's own designs finally caught up, and even after that point, these 4 hulls remained active fleet units for years, standing watch alongside destroyers built decades after them. Then came a strange hybrid, built to plug one more gap while the real solution was still years away. The Type 51C, NATO designation Luzhou, produced 2 hulls, Shenyang and Shijiazhuang, commissioned in 2006 and 2007. Rather than wait for an indigenous, long-range air defense system to mature, engineers grafted the Russian S-300F naval system, complete with its heavy revolver-style vertical launch arrangement, directly onto a Chinese hull that was otherwise closely related to the Luyang family, taking shape at the same time. It was awkward, mechanically complex, and clearly transitional, but it gave the fleet 48 cells of serious, long-range air defense years before China's own systems were ready for sea duty. It was, in every sense, a stopgap, and everyone involved in the program knew it at the time. Looking back, this entire stretch of the fleet reads less like a coherent plan and more like a set of parallel experiments. Indigenous engines here, Russian missiles there, a single oversized testbed hull sailing alone in between. It was messy, but it worked, because every one of those experiments fed directly into the next generation of ships. Chapter 3. The AESA Breakthrough. Stopgaps only work if something better is already coming, and in 2004, it arrived in two very different forms. The Type 52B, NATO designation Luyang I, put two hulls into service, Guangzhou and Wuhan, focused on medium-range air defense, using a missile system derived from Russian designs, paired with the front dome fire control radar. It wasn't revolutionary on its own, but it served as a bridge, refining how Chinese engineers integrated foreign systems into something the Navy could operate and maintain independently, without relying on a foreign supply chain forever. Sailors who served aboard these ships often described them as a stepping stone class, respected but quickly overshadowed by what came right behind them in the same production year. The real leap arrived the very same year, on a ship that looked deceptively similar from the outside but carried a completely different level of technology inside. The Type 52C, NATO designation Luyang II, saw 6 hulls built, led by Lanzhou, entering service from 2004 onward. This was China's first destroyer, equipped with an indigenous active electronically scanned array radar, the Type 346, better known by its nickname, Dragoneye, mounted in 4 fixed flat panels around the superstructure, instead of a single rotating dish. Paired with a 48-cell revolver-type launcher firing the HHQ-9 missile, the Luyang II gave China something it had never possessed before, a genuinely modern, self-designed area air defense system, built without leaning on Moscow for the electronics. 6 hulls doesn't sound like much compared to what came after, but this class proved the underlying technology worked, and that single proof of concept quietly rewrote everything that followed in Chinese destroyer design. There is a version of this story where China simply kept building more Luyang II destroyers for another decade. That version never happened, because the Navy already had something bigger in mind, a hull that would take the same radar concept and put it on an assembly line. Chapter 4. The Workhorse, Type 52D, and its many faces. If the Luyang II proved the concept, the next class proved it could scale into something enormous. Construction on the Type 52D began in February 2012, simultaneously at both the Jiangnan and Dalian shipyards, an early sign of just how seriously China intended to mass-produce this design from day one. The lead ship, Kunming, entered service in March 2014, and what followed wasn't simply a new class, it was effectively a production line. The defining upgrade was the switch to a universal, hot launch vertical launching system, compliant with a new national standard, replacing the older cold launch revolver arrangement inherited from earlier classes. That single change meant one set of missile cells could now fire anti-air, anti-ship, and land attack weapons interchangeably, a flexibility no Chinese destroyer had ever had before, and one that let commanders reconfigure a ship's mission simply by changing what was loaded below deck, without touching the launcher itself. This first production run is now referred to informally as Batch 1, and it alone accounts for more than a dozen hulls entering service through the mid-2010s, each carrying a flat-panel radar array that made the ship look almost identical from one hull to the next, at least to the untrained eye. A second wave followed soon after, refining mast configurations and combat system integration without changing the fundamental hull. For a while, Naval watchers speculated this improved variant might earn its own designation, something like Type 52E, before official sources quietly confirmed it was simply an internal refinement. Batch 2 of the very same class. The changes were incremental, better sensor fusion feeding into the extended range HHQ-9B missile, nothing flashy on paper, but incremental improvements, repeated across dozens of hulls, add up to something genuinely significant on the water. This one was different from anything else in the fleet, simply because of its sheer volume. By the time Batch 3 ships were rolling out through the late 2010s and into the 2020s, the scale of the program had become the real story. By 2024, United States Naval Intelligence estimates placed 13 of the older, non-stretched hulls in active operational service, on top of everything else already counted in the class. Put simply, the Type 52D fleet alone, at roughly 25 hulls, is nearly double the size of the entire Royal Navy's surface combatant force, frigates included. New hulls are still joining the fleet as this is being told. In early 2026 alone, ships named Ganzi and Laudi entered service, each one described by Chinese state media as carrying upgraded radar, weapons, and networking systems over the ships that came before them, proof that a design first launched in 2014 is still being refined more than a decade later, an unusually long production run for any warship class anywhere in the world, let alone one carrying frontline combat systems the entire time. Then, quietly, the hull itself changed shape. Unofficially designated Type 52DL, this stretched variant entered service in 2020 with the commissioning of Zibo. The hull grew 5 meters longer, stretching to 162 meters overall, purely to accommodate a larger flight deck and hangar built around the newer Z-20 helicopter, a rotorcraft roughly comparable in role to America's Seahawk. By 2024, at least 12 of these stretched hulls were in service, with more under construction, and satellite tracking suggests they've been distributed across all 3 of China's fleet commands, not concentrated in a single theater. A single class, built continuously for over a decade, evolving in small steps almost every year. That is not how most navies build destroyers. It is how China builds an entire deterrent, one hull at a time. Production has split fairly evenly between the 2 shipyards over the years, though Jiangnan has consistently built the larger share, with Dalian's first hull only joining the line in February of a more recent year, a detail that shows how even the manufacturing side of this program kept expanding well after the design itself had matured. Somewhere around hull number 128, delivered under the name Ganzi, the class quietly became the most numerous modern destroyer in Asia, outnumbering the combined destroyer fleets of most regional navies put together, a fact that reshapes the balance of power across the entire Western Pacific without a single new class ever being announced. Chapter 5. The Giant, Type 055 enters service. Every escort eventually needs something bigger to escort around, and for China's growing carrier force, that something arrived in the form of the Type 055. Laid down in December 2014 at Jiangnan Shipyard, the lead ship Nanchang was commissioned on the 12th of January 2020 and immediately reset expectations for what a Chinese destroyer, or by some classifications a cruiser, could actually be. At around 180 meters long and displacing up to 13,000 tons fully loaded, it dwarfs the 52D sitting beside it in port, and it made its first public appearance nearly a year before commissioning, sailing past crowds during the PLA Navy's 70th anniversary parade in 2019. But the number that matters most here is 112, the count of vertical launch cells packed into the hull, 64 forward and 48 aft, making it one of the most heavily armed surface combatants anywhere in the world today. The first batch of 8 ships was completed between 2020 and 2023, the final hull, Shenyang, entering service in April that year. Power comes from 4 gas turbines, generating a combined 112 megawatts, feeding a dual-band radar system, the Type 346B paired with a separate X-band array, a sensor architecture broadly comparable to what the American Zumwalt class was originally designed for, but never actually fielded at sea. Beyond the missiles, the ship also carries a 130mm main gun and an 11-barrel close-in weapon system capable of firing 11,000 rounds a minute, a last line of defense against anything that gets through the outer layers. 2 medium-lift helicopters round out the air wing, housed in a stern hangar large enough to service them both at once, giving the ship genuine independent anti-submarine reach far from any land-based air cover, a capability the earliest classes in this story could never have imagined carrying on a single hull. Few outsiders expected the next chapter of this class to arrive so soon. A second production batch is now entering service, with commissioning expected to accelerate through 2026 as part of China's broader 5-year shipbuilding program, reportedly targeting a total of 16 hulls across both batches combined. These newer ships are believed to integrate upgraded turbo generators developed by the 704 Research Institute, providing significantly more onboard electrical power, exactly the kind of power budget future weapons, potentially including directed energy systems, would eventually require. And in December 2025, state media released the first footage of a YJ-20 hypersonic anti-ship ballistic missile launching from the Type 055 destroyer Wuxi, confirming that this hull is now the testbed for China's most advanced strike weapons, not simply its most heavily armed escort. Some analysts still refer to the Type 055 as a cruiser rather than a destroyer, purely on the basis of its size and firepower, even though Chinese sources classify it as a destroyer. That naming disagreement says a lot about how far this program has come, from a fleet built around 3,000-ton hulls in the 1970s, to a debate today over whether its flagship destroyer is even the right word for a ship this large. Chapter 6. The Horizon. What comes after 52D? So what comes next? For years, rumors circulated around a single designation, Type 52E, an enhanced successor imagined to blend the affordability of the 52D with sensors closer to the 055. Speculation pointed to a 96-cell vertical launch system, a dedicated X-band fire control radar for tracking low-altitude threats, an enlarged double hangar for Z-20 helicopters, and a fully electric propulsion architecture that could one day power directed energy weapons. But extensive research across Chinese, Russian, and English language sources suggests that designation was always more internet speculation than shipyard reality. As recently as October 2025, sources close to Chinese naval circles suggested any true successor to the 52D would carry an entirely different designation, something in a still unofficial naming range, referred to informally as 5X or 6X, rather than a simple continuation of the 052 family name. What is certain is that the shipyards themselves show no sign of slowing down. Jiangnan and Dalian continue delivering hulls at a pace of 6 to 10 destroyers a year, a production tempo most navies simply cannot match and cannot fund. Whatever comes after the 52D, whether it lands under a brand new designation or simply becomes another quiet batch upgrade hidden inside an existing hull, one thing about this story has not changed since 1955. China's destroyer fleet has never stood still for long. From 4 borrowed Soviet hulls sailing under a rented flag, to a production line churning out advanced multi-role warships year after year, the arc bends in only one direction. And if the last 70 years are any guide, whatever comes next is probably already under construction, quietly, long before most of the world even hears its name. That, more than any single missile system or radar array, is the real story here. A navy that learned to build faster than anyone could watch, turning a handful of borrowed hulls into the second largest destroyer force on the planet within a single lifetime.